And that is, given the fact that Hashem knows the future, then how is it possible for free will to ever exist, since by the time I make my decision, it is already known what it is I'm going to decide, and Hashem knew it a trillion years ago, whatever it is. So how do you explain the reality of free will? So the Rambam's actual lashon is that we don't have an answer to that question, because he says, since Hashem is an indivisible unity, so every part of Hashem cannot really be divided, and therefore God's knowledge is the same as God's essence, unlike a human being where there's an I and there's my knowledge. With Hashem it's all one thing, and therefore kishem that you cannot understand the Metzias Hashem, you cannot understand His knowledge. Now, so the simple meaning of the Rambam is, I'm not going to answer the question, but I did offer an explanation yesterday that maybe what the Rambam might actually be meaning is that God's knowledge of the future is not based on a time consciousness. It is not based on the notion, right, that I know already what is going to be, because that would mean that there is no choice at the moment of the future. But since Hashem lives above time, so Hashem's knowledge of the future is simply observing a concurrent moment of reality. And as a result, the same way if I observe you davening, I in no way impacted on your choice. God's observing of the future is equivalent to a human observing at a present moment. And therefore, the observation is not something that's prior. It's not like Hashem already knew. It's not an already. He simply sees it as it is happening. And when the Rambam says that Hashem's knowledge is beyond human comprehension, he might mean exactly that point, that Hashem's knowledge is not connected to time. Hashem's knowledge of the future is not knowing it as the future, but knowing it as a present reality. Of course, even that, by the way, I can't escape using time-bound language. If I say it's equivalent to seeing the present, it's a trap. You're always going to be using a time-bound analogy. It's very analogous. There was a very famous, less famous today, but still in print, a 19th century novel that was called Flatland. And the conceit of Flatland was that the whole world, everybody existed on a two-dimensional plane, and one day they're visited by a three-dimensional creature, like us. And it talks about all of the distortions. They really can't perceive three dimensions. Now, obviously, we can perceive three dimensions because that's our reality, but it just shows you that when you're hit with dimensions beyond your immediate experience, by definition, there's going to be a lot of distortions, and Kal V'chomer Hashem that exists in infinite dimensions and the like, we really don't even have the vocabulary. In fact, even physicists that talk about 10 dimensions, 26 dimensions. Again, the numbers are interesting. 10 dimensions are the 10 spheros. 26 dimensions is the gematria of the Shem Havaya, Yud Kei Vav Kei, whatever it is. But in string theory, you have all of these multiple dimensions. You ask a physicist what it even means, what exactly is the 25th or the 26th dimension. They don't know. They cannot even describe it. They can just prove mathematically that these things exist, but there is no reference in the reality we're familiar with that can even describe what those dimensions are. Right? That's kind of the difficulty we have in even describing a physical universe, and then Kal V'chomer describing the Ribbon Shalom. So that's the Rambam's answer, and as I indicated yesterday, the Rivad, Rav Avram ben David, who writes criticisms of the Rambam every few paragraphs, basically says, hey, if you can't give a good answer to a question, better not bother to ask the question. And the Rivad actually gives an answer of his own, which is quite interesting, and I'm going to give you a Tzorech Ian Gadol that I have on the Rivad's answer. The Rivat's answer is a bit revolutionary. The Rivat says, God doesn't really know the future. God predicts the future based on his absolute knowledge of the past. Now, we do know that there is a concept that you can often predict the future with a certain degree of accuracy based on the past. And the Rivad makes the following argument, that God predicts the future. God does not know the future. In fact, the Rivad even seems to say it's a logical impossibility to know the future because the future isn't here yet. Based on the normal understanding we have, it didn't happen yet. So what is there to know? So you can't know the future, but you can predict the future. Now, let me give you a very simple example. Let's assume you go home to mom, Benos Manim, or whatever it would be, and mom serves you ice cream. And it's a simple home. Your only choices are vanilla and chocolate. You don't have the 35 flavors or whatever it is. And mom knows you for 20 years, 25 years, whatever it is. And every single time over those 25 years, you have always asked for vanilla ice cream. But your mother ritualistically asks you every time, would you like vanilla or chocolate? Now, obviously, her 25 years of experience teach her, inform her that you're going to say vanilla. But theoretically, you could surprise her. But generally speaking, because she knows you, and she knows the experiences that you've been through, she knows what you're going to order. So the Rivad says, God does not know that which hasn't happened yet because it hasn't happened yet. But God does have an ability to predict based on his complete knowledge of your past. And human beings can predict as well, but because human beings do not have perfect knowledge of the past, their predictions will not have perfect accuracy. So maybe a good predictor, a good prognosticator may be right 70% of the time, 75% of the time. God predicts with an accuracy rate of 100%, but it's predicated not on knowledge of the future, but on perfect knowledge of what already has happened, perfect knowledge of the past. Now, here is what I consider to really be a tzarich ian gadol of the Rivad. The Rivad is trying to defend free will in light of divine knowledge of the future, and the Rivad's answer is God doesn't know the future, but God predicts based on the past. Now, it seems that instead of being a defense on free will, that is actually an extreme attack on free will. You may remember in American psychology, there was a prominent psychologist at the beginning of the 20th century, a long time ago. His name was John Watson, and Watson made the famous statement that if I knew every single thing that happened to you in your entire life, if I knew every single input into your personality and your body, I would know for certain how you would behave when the next thing happens. Because Watson essentially denied free. Watson indeed was a famous denier of the idea of free will, because he says every decision we make is a product of everything that has happened to us in the past. Now, Judaism would say, not true. Obviously, environmental impacts affect my decision making, but I do have a manual override. So no matter what my situation, I have the capacity to make virtuous choices. But if the Rivad is saying that God knows the future at 100% rate of accuracy, precisely because he knows the past, and God's perfect knowledge of the past gives him a 100% predictive accuracy of the future, is that not the behaviorism of Watson himself? That's exactly what Watson said. Watson said, indeed, maybe he got it from the Rivad, I don't know, that if I knew everything that happened to you, everything, and nobody knows that, right? Nobody knows everything that happened to you. You don't know everything that happened to you. But if a person knew everything that happened, he would be able to predict how the next move would work. So the tzarich and gadol on the Rivad is, on one hand, the Rivad is trying to minimize God's knowledge of the future by calling it predictive accuracy at a level of 100%. But on the other hand, if I could predict at 100% because I know the past, that is actually a negation of the meaningfulness of Bechira. So that's a a bit of a tzarech to try to understand exactly how the Rivad is defending. Now, both the Rambam and the Rivad, of course, affirm the idea that God knows the future. According to the Rambam, God knows the future by experiencing it as a concurrent moment. According to the Rivad, God knows the future based on predictive accuracy. But either way, he knows what's going to happen for sure. And this, of course, is the main view of Judaism, that God knows the future, right? That's a well-known idea. But I just want to point out, maybe I shouldn't introduce the dangerous philosophers, that there was a great Jewish philosopher who actually was the Ramban's nephew. He was the son of the Ramban's sister, and he is Rav Levi ben Gershon, and the name is abbreviated as Ralbag, and perhaps you've heard of him. Now, Ralbag is a very, very interesting person, because it's almost like there are two Ralbags. The Ralbag wrote some very beautiful Perushim on Tanakh. If you take a Mikros Gedolos, you will see alongside the Radak, you will see the Perush of the Ralbag, Rav Levi ben Gershon, and as a commentator on Nach, he is one of the great commentators, and he is considered to be authoritative, and everybody learns. I mean, well, to the degree they learn Nach at all, that's another thing. But those who learn Nach, you're already a little suspicious. But if you learn Nach, Ralbag is one of the commentators that you will consult, again and again. And he also has an interesting thing. Every few prakim, he explains it pasuk by pasuk, and every few prakim, he will summarize the ethical musar lessons that you learn from an event. This is called to'aliot HaRav. To'aliot are purposes. In fact, over the years, that's been taken out and printed as a separate sefer. To'aliot HaRav, the musar that we learned from the VM. Originally, it's part of the Perush, and as I say, it's got printed also as a separate sefer. So that's the Ralbag. So you'd read the Ralbag. Your picture of the Ralbag would be, a great rabbi in the Talmudic tradition who explains Tanakh according to Chazal, etc. Wonderful, wonderful. But the Ralbag was also a philosopher who wrote separate books on Jewish philosophy, and they are among the most controversial books ever written on Jewish philosophy, and typically you will be told not even to look at them. The book is called Milchamas Hashem, The Wars of God, and one of the statements of Ralbag, one of many, the truth is every page is controversial, is he says, who says God knows the future at all? Because what article of faith requires the assumption that God knows the future? Who says? Forget about prediction, forget about knowing the future. It didn't happen yet. If it didn't happen yet, then it cannot be within the ambit of divine knowledge. So the truth is, according to the Ralbag, the whole question of free will and God knowing the future doesn't even start as a question, because the Ralbag says, hey, God doesn't even know the future. Again, I can say this because the Ralbag is Makubal generally as one of the Gedolei Yisrael, so therefore, quoting the Ralbag, I can't be accused of apicorsis, but nevertheless, this is such a revolutionary position that it has not been accepted by anyone else. And as I say, the Ralbag, as it were, almost has I'm not going to say a split personality, but a split identity. In the Perushim Anach, very, very makubal. In the philosophical works, very controversial. And it's interesting, the Ralbag wrote a Perush on the Torah. And I'm not sure why he took a different approach. His Perush al Torah is as philosophically dangerous as his philosophical book. So for some reason, the Perush al Torah he integrated with his philosophical thoughts. The Perush on Nevi'im, he tended to be much more mainstream. That's kind of a curious dichotomy, and that is why you'll find, among other reasons, that every Mikros Gedolos will have the commentary of Ralbag on Nevi'im, and will never have the commentary of the Ralbag ala Torah, although we have that commentary as well. By the way, Ralbag was a bit of a polymath. He was gifted in many fields. He was also an astronomer of note, and in fact, I don't remember if it's a planet or a star or something. There's some astronomical thing that's named after him. It's called Gersonides something. I'll check. I don't remember what it is, but you could Google it. There's an asteroid, I think, that's named after him that either he identified or they just named it in honor of him. And as I say, he was the Ralbag's, he was the Ramban's nephew. He was Ben Achosa. Yeah.
So I guess the Ralbag took another step than the Rivad, took it another step further.
Mm-hmm.
So like, to him, what would Nebuah be? Would it be that Hashem might not know it's going to happen, so Hashem physically makes it happen when it comes? Like the predictive.
Yeah. So again, you're 100% correct. I mean, the Ralbag does not deny that God can make things happen. That's for sure. So when God tells a Navi, God is saying, this is what I'm going to make happen. But in areas of Bechira, which is not God's choice, the Ralbag actually says, God doesn't know. God doesn't know what you're going to choose because he left that up to you. But certainly, Nevuos is when God is saying, this is what I'm going to do, and the like. By the way, there is also just one other final makor to share with you, again, very enigmatic. This is from the Or HaChaim, the great commentary on the Chumash of Rav Chaim ben Attar from Morocco, who died in Yerushalayim, and his kever is on Har Hazeisim. And he actually writes a concept that although God knows the future, but in order to facilitate Bechira, it approaches the Ralbag with a little bit of a twist. Hashem wills himself to be ignorant. There is such a notion as Hashem making a decision to close his eyes. Kav Yachal, I'm speaking in human terms. And the Or HaChaim actually says, through an act of will, Hashem can make himself not know what's going to be in the future. Now, this is a little different than the Ralbag, and in some ways it's less revolutionary. The Ralbag's point was God can't know the future because it hasn't happened. The Or HaChaim says that's not true. Of course God can know the future if he wants to, but in order to facilitate free will, Hashem has willed himself not to know, just as we would close our eyes not to see something. Again, so I think theologically that's less controversial, but it's still a very astounding idea of the notion of the Ribono Shel Olam having conscious ignorance. Yeah.
Would you say that the concept that every generation has someone who's has potential to be the Mashiach, would you say that's more compatible with the Ralbag?
Well, it's certainly compatible with the Ralbag, but I don't see it as incompatible with any other view, because once again, I mean, even though Hashem knows the end of the story, but certainly behaviorally Hashem has to give every generation a chance. So essentially, he says, "Yeah, I know how this story is going to come out, but if you're worthy, this will be the Mashiach. If you're not worthy, we'll have to go to the next person." Yeah.
Going back to the 100% prediction.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why he chose the word prediction, because there's still a slight, space there that we, with our free will, can overcome that prediction.
Yeah, but on the other hand, it's hard to overcome a 100% prediction, right? I know people like to say, I'm with you 105%, but there's no such thing really. So that's the problem. Once you make it 100%, it doesn't look like you have any room there at all. That's why I think there's going to be a problem. Now, if it would be 99.9%, that's one thing. Yeah.
Predictability based on past events, I understand. Is there anybody that looks at predictability from the perspective of Hashem having created the person and knowing him completely, combined with Hashem knowing the person's Bechira point and how much strength he gives that person?
Well, yeah. I mean, when the Rivad says, because Hashem knows your past, Hashem knows your future, predicts your future. Knowing a past is not just, maybe I misstated a little bit. It's not just knowing the events, but knowing how your personality was formed by those events, and therefore what is your breaking point and the like. So, I mean, that's nichlal in knowing. In fact, even under Watson's statement, that's what he meant, that I know everything that went into you, and therefore I know who you are, and therefore I can predict. So yeah, that would be included in the notion of the past. Now, let me go over something else. And I went over this before the at the end of last month, but both for the new people and a little bit of chazara, I do want to go over a little bit about the parameters. Now, again, I did not yet give you all 4 questions. Remember, just to keep you in keep the structure here. I had mentioned to you that the Rambam in the 8th Perek addresses 4 questions about free will. Question number 1, how can free will exist if everything is the will of God? So how do you have the ability to go against his will? And the answer to that was, it is the higher will of God that even though he doesn't want you to do bad, he wants you to have the power to do bad. So in a sense, when you're doing bad, you're not violating his will, you're living within the structure that indeed represents his will. The second question, which is what we've been talking about now, is how do you reconcile free will with Hashem's knowledge of the future? And that's exactly the point that we were talking about. There are 2 more questions that have to be discussed. I'm going to just mention the questions, but then I want to go back to a more general point before we get to that, but I'll just mention the questions. So you will have the 4 questions. And remember, don't use them at the Seder. They're not the Seder questions. And the next 2 questions are textual questions. And that is the following. If you remember in Parshas Lech Lecha, which I guess we're going to read in around 6 weeks, or 7 weeks, Parshas Lech Lecha, we have the covenant of the parts. This is called the Bris Bein Absarim, where Hashem appears to Avram in a vision. And Hashem informs Avraham that his children, his descendants, will be enslaved in a land that is not theirs, and they will be persecuted, but God says, I will take you out. V'gam es hagoy asher yavedu, the nation that enslaves them, dan anochi, I will judge, I will punish. V'acharei chen, and after the punishment, Yetzu, your descendants will leave, birchush gadol, with great wealth. Right? This is the famous prediction, nevuah I should say, not prediction, of the exile in Egypt and the servitude in Egypt, the punishment of the Egyptians, and the eventual wealth of the Jewish people, both physical wealth and the wealth ultimately of Matan Torah. That's also Ruchush Gadol. Now here's the question. Hashem decreed that the Jewish people would be enslaved. Hashem decreed that they would be persecuted. So how could Hashem in justice punish the Egyptians for enslaving the Jewish people? Because if it is true, there can be no punishment unless there is free will. And that was the Rambam's argument. How can I punish a person for doing something evil unless they had the choice not to do it? If I don't have the choice not to do it, it's not fair for Hashem to punish me. In fact, even lahavdil in secular law, this is the basis essentially of insanity defenses. I really didn't know what I was doing. I mean, whether it's true or not is another question, but the theory of an insanity defense is I couldn't control myself. Again, I'm not addressing whether that in fact would be true or not, but in theory, a person who can't control himself should not be morally responsible for what they did. And this is the Rambam's argument. If there is punishment for sin, that presupposes free will. Question is, but God decreed that the Egyptians would enslave the Jewish people, and then God says, and I'm going to punish you for it. So the question is, how could there be punishment without free will? Now that is the Rambam's third question. We'll talk about it. The fourth question is a much more specific one, because Lagabe Well, okay, maybe I'll get ahead of myself. Let me tell you what the Rambam says about the third question, because the answer is not so long. The Rambam says, God never decreed that the Egyptians would be the enslavers. You'll notice in the Pasuk, it doesn't say they will be enslaved by Egypt. And it certainly doesn't say they will be enslaved by, X, Y, and Z. There was no gezerah of Hashem on a particular nation or a particular person to do the evil. Yeah, God decreed slavery, so if the Egyptians didn't step up to the plate, there would have to be some other nation that would make that choice. Of course, what would happen if no nation would make the choice? It's a bit of a conundrum. God made a decree that the Jewish people have to be enslaved, but God did not decree who would do it. So every single person who did it was making a choice, and for that they could be punished and they could be held accountable. Again, it's a bit of a problem. What if nobody made the choice? Okay. How would God's plan come out? That's a difficult issue of Hashem's plan having to be balanced with human choices. That's always going to be a problem. But this is the Rambam's answer. The Rambam's answer is, if Hashem would have told Abraham, the Egyptian people will enslave your nation, then that would have meant they didn't have Bechira. God decreed that so would be the case. But even then, the Rambam says, the individuals within the Egyptian nation didn't have to make that decision. So this explains a lot, in a sense. Like people say the same thing with the Holocaust. If indeed God decreed that 6 million Jews would die, for whatever the reason, we don't know the reason, but if that was God's decree, then how could Hitler or the Nazis be punished for what they did? Their argument would be, hey, if God didn't want them to die, they wouldn't have died. So if they died, it must have been God's will that they die. How can you punish me? The answer the Rambam would give to that is, hey, God didn't tell you to do it. God didn't make you do it. You are living in a world where there's a moral code of Hashem. You broke Hashem's moral code. It's true that the consequences, in a sense, must have been God's will for whatever reason, but that doesn't get you off the hook. This is exactly the learning of the Rambam by Mitzrayim. Hashem did decree that the Jewish people would have to be enslaved. But Hashem didn't tell Egypt to do it. And Hashem didn't tell the individual Egyptian to do it. They were bound by the laws of morality, which are part of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, whatever it would be. And therefore they are accountable. So the Rambam says there is no contradiction between the deterministic gezerah of the Bris Bein Absarim and free will, simply because Hashem never decreed on either Egypt or an Egyptian to enslave. Now, Lamaisa, this is not the end of this. There'll be some difficulty here I'll get to that the Ramban has, but this is the Rambam's answer to question number 3. And as I say, it could also explain Nazi accountability for the Holocaust and the like, because God did not decree that Hitler do what he did, even if God decreed the results of the Holocaust. Now, question number 4 is a different question, and you might be confusing it with number 3. That is the question of God hardening Pharaoh's heart. Now, this is again, this is also about Yetziat, about Mitzrayim, but it's a very different question. That is, the Torah says that when the various Makos came, and normally it would have broken the will of a person. Normally a person would surrender, but God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So he could continue to punish and oppress the Egyptians over and over and over again. And the question is, how could Pharaoh or Egypt be punished? Right, the normal implication of hardening the heart means, I would have given in, but somehow God made it that I just couldn't. Now, I hope you see that the Rambam's answer to question 3 is not a good answer to question 4. Question 3 is Hashem just decreed the Jewish people would be enslaved. He didn't say by whom. So every Egyptian had free will to enslave or not to enslave. Therefore, they're accountable for evil choices. That's the answer to question 3. But the problem is, question 4 is not a general decree of servitude. Question 4 is a specific guy was singled out. Hashem took Pharaoh, and he said to Pharaoh, didn't say, but he made Pharaoh in such a way as you as an individual will not be able to change your mind. I'm locking you into this behavior. Now there, right, it's important that you understand, the question 3 answer is not going to work for this. Because here, Hashem is directly interfering with the free will of an individual person and then punishing him for the decisions he made because God locked him into that state. Okay, again, forgive me for repeating, because I know over the years, people often confuse the Bris Ben Absarim question with Hashem hardening Pharaoh's heart question. They are very, very different questions. And the answer that the Rambam gave to the Bris Ben Absarim is not an answer for Hashem hardening Pharaoh's heart. Okay, but these are the 2 textual questions. With respect to the 4th question, well, we'll leave it over. You can, if you want to do your advanced research, the easiest, I mean, it's in the Shmona Prakim too, but the easiest place to look is in Hilchos Tshuva, where the Rambam has a paragraph describing how Hashem could harden Pharaoh's heart and then punish Pharaoh for the hardening of the heart that HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself occasioned. But these are the 4 basic questions that the Rambam raises about the notion of free will. Okay, see you.